We provide the complete end-to-end solution for environmental consultancy through to habitat creation and ongoing management. We are committed to enhancing and improving the physical environment with a vision to leave the world in a better place than we found it. And today we'll be discussing biodiversity net gain and starting to explore the importance of ongoing stewardship and adaptive management as a critical part of executing biodiversity net gain. Look, I'm pleased to share today that we have an incredible lineup of speakers, including Nick White, Net Gain Principal Advisor for Natural England, Katie Gowers, Senior Policy Advisor, Biodiversity Net Gain for DEFRA. We've got David Lowe, Delivery Leader for Ecology, Historic Environment and Landscape from Warwickshire County Council. We have Jessica Lewis, Group Head of Sustainable Places, Berkeley Group, Anthony Barron, Senior Sustainability Manager at Bacon, Neil Strong, Biodiversity Strategy Manager, Network Rail, and Elizabeth Howard, Environmental Manager, Morgan Sindall Construction. You can expect today to be a fast-paced and informative session sharing early learnings and identifying possible blind spots. We have 75 minutes and our agenda starts to look like this. We're going to kick off firstly with a joint biodiversity net gain update presentation from Nick White and Katie Gowers. This will be followed by a fantastic presentation from David Lowe on maintaining BNG in Warwickshire. And lastly, our expert panel will, for around 30 minutes, discuss the importance of ongoing habitat management in achieving net gain. And for this session, I'll be joined by Jessica Lewis, Anthony Barron, Neil Strong, and Elizabeth Howard. Bit of housekeeping. If you've got any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window, and we'll try our very best to address these as many as possible as we can during the discussion. We look to wrap up the webinar by 11 o'clock, by which time there'll be a 15-minute break where we will then decamp over to LinkedIn for a live Q&A session between 11:15 and 11:45. Look, we'd love and encourage you to, and hope you can join us to continue the conversation there. And then lastly, by the end of our time today, I hope that you'll have gained some knowledge and insight from our expert speakers and start to recognise the importance of ongoing stewardship and adaptive management and how they are to executing biodiversity net gain. So let's kick off into session one. I said it was going to be fast-paced, so let's jump in. And we're going to start with Nick White, Net Gain Principal Advisor from Natural England, and Katie Gowers, Senior Policy Advisor, Biodiversity Net Gain, DEFRA, who will share this joint update on BNG, touching upon on-site and off-site net gain, along with sharing their insights into management and monitoring. Nick, Katie, thank you for joining us, and over to you. I know you've got some slides coming up, so you might have to wait a few minutes to get them updated.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Matt, and good morning, everybody. Just wait for the slides to pop up. So yeah, my name's Nick White. I'm a Principal Advisor for Net Gain at Natural England and joined by Katie Gowers, Senior Policy Advisor for the Registry and DEFRA. I'm going to kick off talking about on-site net gain, and then Katie's going to follow on talking about offset and guidance and some other kind of relevant current policy areas as well. So next slide, please. So for on-site, for too long, we were kind of, when people were talking about things that they could do on a development site, often it ended up like the picture on the left. So that's an actual development project that was asked to deliver a net gain at the end of the development process. Didn't know what to do, stuck up a bird box and a bat box. Not much use to anyone, wasted their time, not providing much for nature. And with on-site mandatory net gain, we're seeking to move the whole industry away from that kind of approach to something much more akin to the opposite image, which is a development site quite close to where I live in southeast London, with some fantastic on-site kind of green infrastructure and landscaping as well, delivering good gains for nature and benefits for the local residents. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about on-site net gain, I like to think of it in terms of 3 steps. So for step one, think about the actual development site itself. So firstly, if you've got an option around site selection where you're looking to deliver your actual development project, firstly try and avoid sites that have got good existing quality habitat. Secondly, identify which of the statutory metrics you should be using as well. There's 2 types. There's the main metric that can be used for any development, but there's also a small sites metric for use on small development schemes. And then begin to undertake an indicative baseline assessment at outline design stage to give you a sense of what you've got, what you're dealing with on that development site. Next slide, please. That information is really helpful because you can use that information to then start to inform your development design. So if you retain existing habitat as far as possible, you'll find it much easier to deliver a net gain. Have a conversation between the landscape professionals, ecologists, the architects, etc., to look at how can you integrate nature, green infrastructure into that site so it can be doing your net gain outcomes, but also potentially delivering other requirements that you need to deliver through that scheme, such as including SUDs to help manage surface water. Also, look to see if there's actually habitats you can deliver or enhance that are locally strategically significant. A local nature recovery strategy will highlight those, or if that doesn't exist, refer to existing green infrastructure strategies or plans. They'll get you extra points, essentially, towards your net gain. Then think about actually what you're looking to try and achieve actually deliverable and maintainable on site. That's a key consideration. Not everything will be, and there will be circumstances where actually ecologically it's better to do stuff off site, and Katie will talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's still plenty of stuff that can be achieved on site. Just make sure it's feasible what you're looking to do. There are good practice principles and standards out there. So a couple of years ago, the British standard BS 8683 was published. That's helpful. Refer to that. Do your final metric calculations to see what is now what's my final outcome on site, and then create your habitat management and monitoring plan for that development. And then my final slide, please. So this is your third step. So this is the post-construction element. So this is where habitats that are being delivered on site, if they're significant, need to be managed or maintained for at least 30 years. So make sure that any contractors that are going to be doing this work have access to understand that habitat management and monitoring plan. It's going to be critical for them to help them ensure they've got, they know what to do, they're able to manage and maintain it, and that you've got confidence that they are competent to be able to do that as well. Also, make sure there's a resourcing mechanism available to help deliver that long-term management and monitoring as well. Be that, how is that going to be funded into the future? And then the scheme will be expected to be providing periodic reporting back to the local planning authority, who can enforce against failure to deliver as well. So that's the kind of three stages from my perspective of on-site net gain delivery. And then I think we're handing over to Katie to do the off-site element.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. So as Nick described, I'm going to talk us through how we're maintaining biodiversity net gain in relation to offsite delivery. So for context, I'm a DEFRA's BNG team, but work on register policy and on work around how we're securing gain sites. So next slide, please. So I'm going to run us through some recent announcements which are relevant to offsite delivery, and then we're going to have a little look at how we're securing biodiversity gain sites, habitat management and monitoring, and I'm going to give a brief update on the register and credits. Next slide, please. So recent announcements, I'm sure most of you will already be aware, but the consultation response on biodiversity net gain regulations and implementation went live back in February. And this will outline how BNG will work in practice, and the requirements we'll be setting out for secondary legislation. So there's a lot of information there if you haven't already read it. And we've also released a couple of pieces of guidance recently in relation to offsite delivery. So one piece on how land managers can take part in the offsite BNG market, and another on combining BNG payments with other ecosystem payments, so effectively stacking guidance. And just to note that all these links should have been put in the chat as well. So thanks, Jill. Next slide, please. So to get into the subject matter today, how are we maintaining gains for 30 years? And the key to this is the legal agreements that are securing the sites. So for offsite delivery, I'm talking about Section 106 agreements or planning obligations, which are between the landowners and the local planning authority, and conservation covenants, which are a new type of legal agreement between the landowner and a responsible body. So the relevant provisions within the Environment Act for conservation covenants came into force back in September. So they are technically live, and some guidance was produced at that time on getting and using a conservation covenant. But the responsible body designation process is not yet live. So in the coming months, that will be launched, and there'll be some further guidance provided on how to apply to be a responsible body as well. So I just briefly wanted to get into the detail of how these agreements can actually effectively secure sites for 30 years. So some considerations for the drafting of these agreements. And I think first and foremost, when you're entering these agreements, you need to ensure the gains are actually achievable. There are obviously 30-year agreements with objectives set out and enforcement in place. So it's really key that we're making sure they're practical and what we're setting out is actually possible. So as much as it's great to have aspirations of really high distinctness habitats, and that might be possible, you do have to consider the land you have and any limitations associated with it. And then the second point is just making sure these agreements are sufficiently detailed. So this is already a point of principle in the drafting of Section 106 agreements, but essentially ensuring that you're drafting the obligations in such a way that they are enforceable. And on enforcement, make sure your agreements set out enforcement protocols. So what enforcement is available under these different agreements is already set out within the relevant sections of the Town and Country Planning Act and Environment Act, but making sure that your agreement details how, why, when enforcement will be taking place. And then a really key one is appropriate funding. They're 30-year agreements, and obviously you need funds for the full 30 years because we don't want to be in a situation where a landowner gets to year 10 and they can't carry out the rest of the management for the site. So making sure you have an appropriate payment structure in place and that payment secured is going to be really key. And also factoring all the costs over that 30-year agreement, which is obviously quite a task to think about everything that might happen, but thinking about the costs of the habitat creation, the management, the maintenance, cost for remedial action if the habitat fails, cost for the responsible body and LPA and other professional advice. So that's going to be really important. And then just obviously making sure your agreement sets out how monitoring will happen to review progress of you meeting the objectives within the agreement and reporting of that monitoring back to the relevant local planning authority or responsible body. Next slide, please. So another key point when we're talking about maintaining gains is the habitat management and monitoring of that site. So habitat management and monitoring information will be required for registration and will be published on the register. And I just wanted to note as well that Natural England is developing a habitat management and monitoring template, which is currently undergoing user testing and is anticipated to be available by late summer and early autumn. And a really important point when we're talking about habitat management, which is probably going to come up a fair bit today, is essentially assuring that it's adaptive. Again, these are 30-year agreements. That's a really long time. And in light of the context of climate change, just in terms of seasonal variation and changing technology over the 30 years, I think it's really important that management is adaptive and there are regular reviews of the habitat management and monitoring proposals for your site to make sure you're still achieving the objectives. And I touched on this in the last slide, but ensuring that you set out remedial action if the habitats fail to establish. So we need to be practical again, and nature is unpredictable and it might be a situation where you can't meet your targets. So just making sure you set out what you could do to bring the habitats back to where they should be. And next slide, please. Then I'll just give a brief update on the register. And I just wanted to touch on process in terms of the register because we get a few questions around this. And you have to secure your game site before you register your site. So the Section 106 agreement or conservation covenant is required before registration. And a copy of that will be uploaded as you register your site. And this is to ensure that the LPA or responsible body deem the habitat enhancements you're proposing are actually achievable. And in terms of a habitat bank delivery model, you don't need to secure the whole land area prior to the sale of any units, but when units are sold, the associated parcel of land which is delivering the game must be secured and registered. So either model is fine, but there's a degree of flexibility there if you want to do it on a parcel by parcel basis. In terms of the register, you'll probably know from the consultation response, but Natural England will be named as the register operator. So they'll be checking the applications to register a site and allocate units against eligibility criteria. And basically verifying whether they're acceptable. And if they are, then the site will go on the public register. And in terms of timelines, it's an obvious point, but the register will go live in time for mandatory BNG. Next slide, please. So today we're talking about maintaining games for 30 years, but I did briefly want to touch on what happens after 30 years because we get quite a lot of questions around this. So we hope that very few biodiversity game sites are taken out of conservation management entirely after 30 years. Obviously, the policy intent here is to increase biodiversity, so it'd be quite counterproductive. So they could be re-entered in the biodiversity net gain market or other nature markets. And I also wanted to note that in the recent consultation response, we have proposed to allow the stage sale of enhancements where habitat enhancements have been achieved before the end of agreement. So that effectively means if you've entered a 30-year agreement for a medium distinctiveness grassland habitat and you reach that target at year 15, you could then update your legal agreement for a further 30 years on top of the remaining 15 to take that to a higher distinctiveness grassland habitat, which would obviously need to be in line with what you've already achieved on your site in terms of like ecological robustness. But that's also an option. Next slide, please. While we're talking about 30-year agreements, I also just wanted to bring your attention to a consultation that's live at the moment from Treasury because we get quite a few questions around tax in relation to biodiversity net gain sites. So this consultation is a call for evidence on the tax treatment of the production and sale of ecosystem service units and a consultation about the scope of agricultural property relief from inheritance tax. So if anyone wants to respond to that, then responses are required by the 9th of June, and they'll obviously release a consultation response in due course after that. Next slide, please. And then I'll just give a brief update on credits, which obviously isn't fully relevant to what we're talking about today, but as I'm talking about offsite, I'll give a quick update. So indicative credit prices will be published 6 months in advance of BNG becoming mandatory, and the prices will be intentionally uncompetitive with the market, as obviously credits are a last resort in line with the mitigation hierarchy. So we'll be reviewing the prices at 6 monthly intervals in response to market data once the mandatory requirement is in place, and Natural England will be selling the statutory biodiversity credits on behalf of the Secretary of State via a digital sales platform. Next slide, please. And finally, I'm just going to talk through some next steps, so what to expect from us in the coming months. So we'll be publishing other guidance in phases covering a diverse range of topics, including some of what we've spoken about today, so how we're securing game sites, so what you need to include in your legal agreements, and habitat management monitoring and reporting. All guidance will be shared in the BNG Gov.uk area, of which there should be a link in the chat. Then we'll continue working on the development of secondary legislation, the development of the register and the credit sales platform. And as I mentioned before, responsible bodies will be designated with further guidance published. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick and Katie, for that whistle-stop tour. And look, I appreciate everyone. I've seen a bit of comments in the stuff that this has been there's a lot of information there that's been shared by Nick and Katie. Look, the slides will be shared afterwards for digestion, and some of the detail that Nick and Katie started to go into around some of the management piece will be covered off in more detail as we go through this webinar. Absolutely. I see there's a lot of questions coming through on the chat, and look, we will try and circle back to these during the panel discussion at the end of the webinar. And if not, look, please join us on the LinkedIn live Q&A where Nick and Katie will be able to answer some more of those detailed questions that have been posted through. So let's move this forward, because I'm just conscious we do have the time limits. I'm delighted to introduce you to David Lowe, Delivery Leader for the Ecology, History and Environment and Landscape at Warwickshire County Council. Warwickshire operates its own biodiversity net gain programme, and David will share with us today his insight and learnings on BNG and management today. David, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. I'll just wait for my slides to pick up. Thank you for inviting me being here. I've only got 15 minutes, and I usually can go on for about 2.5 days on this one. So I will be brief, and I will try and talk slowish so you can get a hang of it. But next slide, please, because that is me. And I'm going to basically talk about biodiversity net gain through this, but working my way through green infrastructure and biodiversity net gain. But I've also got there on Environment Act and local nature recovery strategies as optional, because I don't think I'm going to fit them in the 15 minutes. But any questions anyone has on how they integrate together, then maybe you can put them in the questions, even though I'm not on LinkedIn myself, so I'm going to get them emailed apparently, or just be shouted at and to answer the questions at the end of it. Next slide, please. So that's with my team, my wonderful team, and today we're basically focusing on the planning aspects, which I have, and I have 7 SLAs with all my districts and boroughs who are critical in the delivery of biodiversity net gain, and we're lucky, very lucky in Warwickshire to have a really good working relationship with all the districts and boroughs in the two-tiered system that we are. And recently, I've just set up a natural capital team to look after the biodiversity net gain elements and other ecosystem markets, which we are generating and developing within Warwickshire, which I'll come to at the end of this slide as well to give us the way forward. But if you want to count those figures, there's around about 16 ecological officers in my area, so we are probably the largest ecology unit in the country. It gives for information and advice type aspects, and we also do project work, and we also have a record centre as well. So we have a whole gambit under my control, and this is where I usually do my evil laughter. Next slide, please. So where's my journey been? Well, this is a brief summary to say it all. Started in 2009 to 2012 to write the Green Infrastructure Strategy, which was produced in 2013. And that's when this harebrained idea of biodiversity offsetting, no net loss as it was then, and we were a DEFRA pilot between 2012 to 2014. Voluntarily, I hasten to add. So I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning doing most of this stuff and ended up building 90% of what is now a DEFRA metric 4.0. And we are currently on 19.1. So good luck. And we did test it out, and we decided actually this was the best thing since sliced bread for biodiversity net gain. And I've been doing talks like this for ensuing 10 years. We moved into the implementation around about 2015 onwards, because that's when we started getting 616 monies coming in. So we were in partnership with the Environment Bank at that time, but at 2 years, MOU ran out. They went off to Cheshire and elsewhere, and so we had to look after our own brokeraging sites. So we started doing brokeraging and found going to an FU, finding offset sites, doing our own sites on country parks, etc. To open up, our philosophy was to open up an open market from day one, which I'll come to in a second. We're now moving into more of a regulatory function as well, because people like things to be accredited. They want to know if they're going to buy a unit, is it a regulatory unit, etc. Is it approved by Warwickshire County Council in that way? And I guess that's what the registry will also be doing in that sense. Whether they still would like to ensure that that offset site is still tick boxed locally, we're going to find out, and that's going to be an interesting one on regulation as well, that accreditation type question. And then the future of where we're going to do next with environmental net gain and not just biodiversity net gain. Again, I'll come on to that in a second. Next slide, please. So the GI strategies is where it all started, green infrastructure strategy, where it all started. And we wrote a GI strategy in 2013. I did to form 3 parts. There's part A, part B, and part C. Part A was not supposed to change much. It was like regulations and where we're all coming from and going to. And then, of course, we had Environment Act and we had Brexit. So there's a few things happened there. So we are currently rewriting it to bring it all up to date and modernise it, because it is now 10 years old, but still promoted as one of the better ones in the country, I understand. But part B was an assessment and criteria. So what is a green infrastructure asset? And that's where that's defined and where we want to get to. And part C was maps, which could change annually, or landscape character, etc., could change later. And it covers, as I say at the top there, landscape, accessibility, and biodiversity. So that's our GI strategy. The important part of our GI strategy was Annex A. Annex B actually was biodiversity offsetting. So we integrated biodiversity offsetting into our GI strategy. So our GI strategy became an SPD in all effects. And that was adopted by all our districts and boroughs, Solihull and Coventry. And that laid out how we were going to deliver biodiversity net gain, offsetting as it was called then. And it still will do. We're currently rewriting it to now actually include Annex B is now going to be called the, wait for it, Warwickshire Ecosystem Service Trading Protocol. There you go. West P as the inspector for carbon net zero called it. And I thought, well, it sounded good at the time anyway. I dreamt that acronym up. And that's going to include, that's now going to detail how we're going to try and do stacking and bundling for carbon, and which was a carbon market we're just establishing at the moment, as well as a biodiversity again, all in a mandatory world within an SPD. So thank you for producing the Green Infrastructure Finance document and the Nature Markets document just popped up, and the links to the bundling of the nutrients, etc. We'll put that into that strategy, that protocol. Next slide, please. Just keeping an eye on time. So in the biodiversity, in that GI strategy, we have identified strategic areas because we had to, because there was a strategic factor within the biodiversity net gain. So we did it very simply and saying, is there 20 hectares or more of that woodland or that grassland in that 1 kilometre square? And if there are 20 hectares or more, then that square can function as one big whopping woodland or one big whopping grassland. That was the general philosophy. We set the bar low, so these are buttercup fields, not wildflower meadows. Otherwise, Warwickshire will be completely white because our grasslands are basically stuffed. Our woodlands are better on the left-hand side of Warwickshire in the Forest of Arden area, but the Rugby side is more open landscape, and therefore we don't really want big, large woodlands in those areas. Otherwise, it would upset the landscape character of that side. So you won't be able to see quite on those maps, but there is a darker brown colour, which is where we have 20 hectares or more. And the ones you can see coloured in are where we have 5 to 19 hectares of grassland, of wildflower grassland in those squares. So as you can see, they're fragmented, small and stuffed. So what we need to do is more, bigger, better and connected is what the GI strategy says. And that gives an idea of where our strategic areas are the lighter brown blobs to turn them into darker brown blobs, and where there's just that yellow, that white sort of squares is less than 5 hectares of wildflower grassland. So our aim is to honeypot all biodiversity net gain where we can into those strategic areas, the lighter browns, so we can actually start joining them up, because no parcel of land fits nicely into a 1 kilometre square. They overhang squares, and therefore those squares adjacent to them have been turning a different colour as time goes by. Moving on to the next slide, please. I won't go into biodiversity net gain as a metric, because Nick did a bit of that in that sense, and there's other masterclasses, I'm sure, on how to use a biodiversity metric. But in essence, that is what biodiversity net gain does in the planning application world. You value the existing habitat minus the value of a future habitat, and you get a gain or a loss. If it's in our metric, we put if it's green, it's good. If it's red, it goes to section 106, and that's what we just tell councillors. Councillors go, oh, excellent. What about species? We keep them out of it. Species we just deal in a normal way, so let's just keep the habitats. And the councillors go, oh, I get it. I like that. Green, good. Red, Dave, love it. And leave it as that. So what do you do if there's a visual loss? As Nick says, and Kate says, you find your own offset site, or in our case, you could pay Warwickshire County Council a tariff. Now we're going to be stopped doing that. You're going to have to go to DEFRA to buy your tariffs, etc. So that's going to finish at some time after November in Warwickshire. But that was a tariff being, you can pay through a nose if you like, and we'll do it all for you type stuff. So in other words, we were trying to incentivise habitat banks being set up within Warwickshire, and it works. We have quite a few offset sites, but I'll come to those in a second. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a development site in what was a local wildlife site at that time. It was doubly allocated as a housing site as well as a local wildlife site in Rugby very early on in the days. Probably, hopefully, won't happen now. But we used biodiversity net gain on this site to create as you can tell, quite a green, low density housing, which secured all the woodland around the edge of it, which was a nature conservation interest, and a nature reserve alongside a railway line for the grass snakes, which are on that site as well. There was a loss. So the brilliant thing about this is the landscape architects, the ecologists, and they all work together, to make a win-win-win solution. And it was a brilliant example, other than the fact that it was a local wildlife site and shouldn't have happened in the first place. Moving swiftly on. Next slide, please. How do we deal with offset sites? We have habitat management monitoring plans, HUMPs. I love that acronym. Where we look at a baseline habitat survey condition metric calculation, and it has the objectives and prescriptions and monitoring program. It's based on a full format management plan for those who remember the NCC old templates, because that's how I was trained at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust to write, and those are documents you would normally write for SSIs, and they are utopian visions of what you would really want to do if you won a lottery. Well, in this way, biodiversity again is pretty much about winning of a lottery. So you should be able to, or could be able to, consider everything you would like to do for that habitat or that nature reserve, that parcel of land. And that's a good thing to look at it. You could also look at it saying, this is what I want for biodiversity net gain to deliver. And as you rightly say, Katie said, you could then look to see what we want to do in the next 30 years. So you could business plan your land. So you say, I want to get to this point at this point, and in 30 years. And then after the next 30 years, I'll sign up to another 30-year agreement and sell the biodiversity for that 30 years. Or at that time, possibly sell the nutrient neutrality from that, or the carbon from that if a soil carbon code comes out. So think of it as a business plan for the next 30 years of what you want to do with that land. Next slide, please. We have a section 39 Wildlife Countryside Act agreements. The section 39 says that in a wildlife countryside, says that a local authority can enter into agreement with a landowner for purposes of nature conservation. So that's how we've done it for 10 years. Not these conservation covenants are about to come out. We probably have to move to those because the Environment Act says you should secure biodiversity gain through a section 106 or a conservation covenant. We're seeking legal advice, or we're working at the moment that actually we are securing this through a section 106 obligation within a planning application through a section 39 Wildlife Countryside Act. So one has to leave to the other. We believe we're okay with that, but we asked DEFRA kindly if they could help us, and they said seek legal advice. So that's a question I would like to raise somewhere if I was in LinkedIn. but they secure. So we do have legal agreements to secure that management, and we've clawback clauses if you don't do what you say you're going to do, and it's not an act of God. We will ask for the money back and deliver biodiversity again elsewhere. Next slide, please. So the legal agreements, we've adopted quite a few. We've got an annual payment one, so we may take in £500,000 and we give an annual fee to a landowner to do what they need to do as part of that agreement. We have full agreements where we pay that landowner the full whack from our pot, so they get the full money up front. We're looking to work out how the investment rules for that as part of our natural capital investment strategy, which we're preparing at the moment. And we have regulatory agreements where people want to sell the units into the market themselves. And we just take a regulatory fee for every unit they sell to give them a unique identifying code. And there's a unreadable flow diagram below, which basically explains how we do that. But we literally have any agreement within our Section 39 to make it happen. And we're happy to talk to anyone to do that. We have now coming up to about 5 private investors who are selling units into the market themselves. We have two full payment agreements about to be signed, and we have quite a few annual payments going out as well, which means that County Council has a few £1 million in a pot, which is slowly being drawn down on an annual basis for the next 30 years. Next slide, please. What happens after 30 years, I say, is always interesting. This is a slide I put to this CLA about a few weeks ago, because that's the way the question was, what happens after that 30 years? The question is it going to get burdened by letters? Is it going to be a local wildlife site, a SSSI, a SAC site by the end of it? And my answer is probably a local wildlife site. They are currently only protected under planning. So we wouldn't really want to enter agreement with anyone if we think that that's going to be built houses on, etc. later. We wouldn't sign up to it as part of a Section 39 Wildlife Countryside Agreement. And that's the type of thing we would like to ensure as still part of the regulatory planning system. We will check those things before we sign it off as a bona fide obligation or condition of that part of that planning application. Similarly, SSSI, I doubt it. I don't know if Natural England are doing any more SSSIs. I think I don't know when the last one was done. And SACs, well, again, I doubt it'll become a European site at that stage, maybe in 100 years dream, but not within that 30-year agreement at least, etc. Next slide, please. So this is where we're going to in the future. This is our natural capital investment strategy in Warwickshire County Council, or hope to be if I get my way. It is where we've got a pot of money, which will never-ending pot of money. It'll just sit there, hopefully getting bigger and bigger with the money because it's going out annually to a landowner. What do we do with that millions of pounds in that 30-year period? Can we invest it in a way that we can get interest enough to pay all those annual fees and my staff to deliver that, so that we can have, as you say, a never-ending pot, but more money we could use to invest into more habitat banks, other local nature recovery strategy initiatives, grant systems, those sort of side of things to do more, bigger and better, move more species stuff, that type of thing to complement the habitats which we're creating. So we've got biodiversity again, tick box done. Carbon capture, Warwick District Council has just gone through public inquiry, examination in public for a net zero carbon mandatory requirement to buy carbon. So we're about to set up a Warwickshire carbon market. The reasons being is that we only have at least 5 units of woodland a year. So therefore, biodiversity again will not deliver the woodland we need to deliver to save the planet, or save Warwickshire at least. And we're also looking at water quality and tourism as prescribing as other mechanisms for ecosystem services under what we're looking at as an environmental net gain policy. Next slide, because I've run out of time, I think. So that's what we're heading to do, investing in natural capital. And so far, the map on the right-hand side, it basically shows all the purple sites are HS2 or our offset sites we have on our books at the moment. 2 of those green sites are actually live habitat banks, and the other 2 are hopefully maybe we could actually get investment sites, buy some land in that area, or entice a farmer to do some big offsets in those sites. And as you can see, those impossible brown blobs are beginning to be joined up already. I'll leave that as is. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's great. That's super insightful. And it's clear that your knowledge and experience over the past 10 plus years is going to be super important in helping us transition and fulfill our BNG requirements as a nation. And particularly your thoughts about what happens beyond that 30 years and that transition towards wider environmental net gain. So yeah, thank you for that, David. Look, I can see some great questions appearing in the chat, and thank you for sharing. And look, likewise, thank you to, and just reading down that chat, thank you to Nick, Joe, Oliver, and others who have been responding in the chat. It's great to see that community chat going there. So that is awesome. So we are on to, and we are on time. So thank you, Nick, Katie, and David for keeping on track. So we're heading to our final session, and I'm thrilled to invite to the floor our BNG panel. So please join me in welcoming Jessica Lewis, Group Head of Sustainable Places at Berkeley Group. We've got Anthony Barron, Senior Sustainability Manager at Thacum, Neil Strong, Biodiversity Strategy Manager at Network Rail, and lastly, Elizabeth Howe, Environmental Manager, Morgan Sindall Construction. But before we dig into that discussion piece, I'm just going to ask each panelist to just share a brief introduction about their organisation's BNG strategy, their approach to habitat management with some headline examples. And then following discussion, we'll focus on some of these challenges, some of the early learnings, and what happens next. So look, we've got about half an hour or so to kick this around the table as a debate, which is great. So let's kick this off, and Jessica, over to you.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, as Matt said, I'm Jessica Lewis, Head of Sustainable Places for Berkeley Group. I've worked with Berkeley Group for over 10 years, both at project level, so implementing BNG and other sustainability requirements on our sites, and more recently I've moved to Berkeley Group to work in our sustainability team on a more strategic level, so looking at the requirements that we're setting for our projects. So since 2017, Berkeley have been designing all of our new developments with a BNG, regardless of the site's context or former use. And then in 2021, we strengthened that commitment to put the requirement for a 10% net gain on all of our new developments. So since making that commitment, we have created over 100 acres of nature-rich grassland, 170 acres of woodland, wetlands, 52 acres of living roos. And really we've gone from producing kind of amenity grassland with a few sort of aesthetic borders to really creating nature-rich environments. And you can really see the difference from the ones that are now being implemented that committed to that BNG versus the earlier developments that there's a lot more hard landscaping. You can just walk on a development and tell. Our project teams have really embraced this. I think they've really seen kind of the holistic benefits. Of course, creating habitats and in turn sort of mitigating against flood risk and increasing climate resilience, but also, the community side, giving people access to nature on our sites, making our sites publicly accessible, which creates an active development and in turn a better community and better integration of the surrounding communities. And we've also seen, sales values increase with homes that have that view of nature. So there's lots of benefits to that we've seen as a business and the project teams have also seen. And now, I guess we are turning our focus and concentrating on ensuring the quality of that installation, looking at our internal processes, and then looking at that long-term management part. We've got over 50 developments with a commitment to net gain since 2017. Our projects are usually multi-phased long-term regeneration sites. So out of those 50, only 2 of those are 100% complete. So I just really wanted to start with saying, there's still time to get that long-term management part right. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jessica. Anthony, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So, hello everyone. I'm Anthony Barron. I'm the Senior Sustainability Manager at Thacum. We're a medium-sized house builder based in West Sussex. Similar to Berkeley, we've been delivering biodiversity net gain of at least 10% on all our developments since 2020. I think we've kind of learned from that process that that there's a lot of stuff we need to look at that supports the principle, supporting principles and practices that go along with the net gain process that we now need to embed, and that way we've been working with Plant Life and other partners to look at how we develop our approach to creating and then the maintaining of nature-rich places that both reinforce that process but also go beyond the metric to consider all those things that can't be measured in a habitat-based metric. And as David spoke about earlier, starting to make that gap between biodiversity net gain and starting to look at how we move on to environmental net gain on all the other stuff that nature can deliver for us on a development. So to that end, this set of principles will look at design. Obviously, really important to get that done early in the design process to embed nature as early as possible. Empowering communities, which I think is a really important bit of how we get people along with us in this journey, so they understand the value and they understand why things are managed in a certain way. And then that leads on to that kind of nature stewardship stage, which I think is obviously the main topic of discussion today. Everything from effective management plans and as well as the support, training and capability of the management and maintenance companies we use, which is a huge area of improvement, I think, for us as an industry. And then obviously the bit that often doesn't get talked about because it isn't as interesting is that checking, learning and sharing from what we've done. And as Jess has kind of alluded to, we need to know what went right, what didn't go right, and then help our management companies to kind of deliver it better in the future. So we're actually delivering on the biodiversity net gain we committed to in practice. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of what we're looking at the moment, trying to go beyond just delivering the metric process and look at all those principles and practices that support it.
Fantastic, thanks Anthony. Neil, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks Matt, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. So I'm Neil Strong, I'm Biodiversity Strategy Manager at Network Rail, and at Network Rail we look after a very thin slice of Britain, just 52,000 hectares, but across the whole of England, Scotland and Wales. And having said that, we also probably have the most neighbours. 7 million people live next to our fence line, and 1/3 of the population of Britain lives within 500 metres of a railway. So we can really annoy a lot of people really very quickly if we try hard enough. And when we do work, we have to work across the whole of the network at all times of the year. And as you'll know, that can have an impact on habitats and biodiversity. But when we're doing that work, we've got this opportunity to be supporting nature recovery across Britain. We've already created a baseline of the habitats that we've got using remote sensing across the whole of the network. And from that, we've been able to quantify the amount of biodiversity that we've got for the first time in the history of the railway, so the first time in 200 odd years. And that data has then helped us do some feasibility work with the Forestry Commission to look at finding those places where we can actually start planting trees next to the railway. And those locations have been identified based on a number of criteria, including making sure that we're not putting trees on designated sites, not on archaeological sites, not on high grade agricultural land, and just making sure that it is places where we're not going to have problems with the trees in the future. And of the 3 million hectares of land data that we've got and that we've looked at, almost 1/3 of that has some potential for putting trees in the ground, which that work aligning with the England Woodland Creation Offer, the grant schemes, the Future Elms scheme, it means that we can then start looking at making sure that we're getting the right habitats in the right place. That's also going to help the biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and all the other things that we know we need to do. And so when doing that, to support colleagues who are working on the railway to make sure that they have the right information, we've got many, as people on the call will know, we've got many standards and guidance documents across the railway. These are there to help people make the right decisions, and we just need to make sure that all that fits into the right processes. We've got a new sustainable land use strategic framework, which helps us making sure that we can do that work and do it right. And the rewards can support species recovery, we can support mental health and well-being, and a safe and efficient railway network. And by following those processes, asking the right questions, taking part in these sorts of events, seeking advice, that's going to help us demonstrate that we can be custodians of that really thin slice of Britain. And it's the work that colleagues are already doing across the network that is looking at improving the land that we've got, but also working with others on the other side of the fence to make sure that we take that landscape view that's really important to how we then go on and manage the biodiversity, not only on our side of the fence, but throughout Britain as well. So thank you.
Fantastic, Neil. Thank you for that. And Elizabeth.
Hiya. Thanks for having me. My name's Elizabeth Howarth. I am an environment manager for Morgan Sindall Infrastructure. We are an infrastructure company delivering upgrades to the railway network, the road network in energy, water, and also nuclear. I work in the rail division, and I've been with the company about 2.5 years. And as you can imagine, apart from the nuclear work we do, most of our work takes place in the footprint of sites, which are quite long and skinny, as Neil has already alluded to. So we deliver the projects that come to the market from our clients, such as Network Rail and Transport for London. And so Morgan Sindall Infrastructure has a big role in helping to deliver the biodiversity requirements from those clients. A part of a challenge that we have is that we come to site and we deliver our work and then we leave again, hopefully having given nature the best start possible. But it's putting in place those long-term management plans can be quite difficult, because we know that we're not going to be around to monitor them. And so the work that we do with the client and with local landowners is very important. That's it from me.
Fantastical. Thank you very much for that. And I guess as the audience here, I hope they can see and demonstrate that the panel built up with a range of people working on both infrastructure and satellite sites across the sectors of infrastructure and house building and stuff. So that's great. So let's kick off into the discussion and get into the detail and stuff. So let's go to you, Jessica. We can start with this. And look, as an organisation, as you said, has been implementing BNG since 2017. What are the real challenges that you're facing, particularly, and this is the key point here, where the long-term management is being delivered by a management agent kind of thing once you've finished your works? And what actions are you taking to address some of these foreseen risks?
Yeah, I think for us it's going to be kind of a step-by-step approach, and you know, as Anthony touched on, there's definitely a knowledge gap, and that is one of the main focuses this year is talking to our managing agents, talking to the landscape contractors that they're working with. You know, the good news is that we are finding that, you know, they are interested, and you know, talking about that they want to get it right. So we're looking at it really from both an internal process kind of way, and then also looking at their external, the managing agents processes. And I think some of the things that can help them with that is, obviously, you know, we'll probably hold workshops and knowledge share and upskill, but practical things like the management and maintenance plans, making them so that actually the managing agent can understand them. So if they've got a landscape contractor coming on their sites, that managing agent needs to be able to audit the work of that landscape contractor, and that's, you know, quite removed from their skill set at the moment. And then looking at sort of the more contractual arrangements, so looking at, you know, what clauses do we need to put in the managing agents agreements, what kind of, you know, there's the long-term part, but there's also those putting in those right KPIs for us to be able to track kind of year on year. So yeah, they're some of the things that we're looking at the moment. I think other risks for us is, and when I talk about that step by step, is that next step of, okay, we bring on a managing agent for a certain number of years. If it's a phase development, we can be on a site for 10 to 30 years. Majority at the moment are probably somewhere around 10, but what happens to that extra 20 when we actually leave? There's a residents association in place that actually get to choose that managing agent, and that managing agent can change. So there's, I guess, yeah, a bit of exploring for us to do in terms of the legal side and that kind of long-term arrangement when we eventually do leave the site.
Absolutely, and I can totally see that those longer term considerations and risks are absolutely needed. But you come back to a real key point there, Jessica, and actually, and at the heart of this, and for us as part of our contracting business, actually understanding those management plans for the people on the ground delivering is super important. It's how do we take those kind of habitat management and monitoring plans that are going to be required through the formal process and stuff, and actually make it digestible and readable and legible and actionable by the boots on the ground. That actually the guys that are managing these and look, we work hard in our business by virtue of us having our consultancy piece and our contracting and management to actually really harmoniously try and link that, because it's so important that we convey that early information, that stewardship works that we need doing, and that it delivers on the ground. So no, thank you for that. Absolutely. So Anthony, just going to you on the same thing, because you work in the same environment. Can I get some of your views on early learnings and how you're addressing some of these similar challenges that you're seeing through ongoing management arrangements?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'd agree. You know, a robust and easy to follow management plan is at the heart of this, because that sets the standard for what you're going to deliver. And you know, we're very keen on simple visual standards within them to support them, so that, you know, people know what it should look like, what good looks like, and as Jess said, then that can be audited and checked it's actually being delivered as it should be. So yeah, these things are written at planning stage, often really aren't getting the engagement and involvement from people who know how to deliver management when they're written. So yeah, that's really important. I'd also say they need to be flexible. You know, with the dynamic nature of the natural world, even on a fairly basic development, they need to adapt to that management. Similar to what Katie was saying for the offset site stuff, you also need that for the on-site stuff. Training and is really important as well, but equally there's opportunity to partner these organizations with guys who know what they're doing. There's a lot of great expertise out there, and you know, partner them with expert organizations, so that when we're gone, there is someone there to hold their hand and go, right, this is how to do this, here's some advice if something goes wrong, and adapt to opportunities as well as bits of habitat that might fail. And as part of that kind of engagement and training is also the people who live there. And if you can make them care or make them understand how things are managed, they'll be an ally rather than potentially an enemy who might be the keyboard warrior who might go to Twitter or Facebook to say, why is this managed like this? Why does this look like a mess? Instead, they can be the eyes and ears on the ground doing some of that citizen science and going, this doesn't look quite right because I know we're supposed to be managing it like this. So yeah, I think it's kind of that engagement is a really important bit, but also just laying the ground with a really simple and easy to use management practices.
Absolutely. Have you got any thoughts and share any learnings of how you actually engage the community? And that's probably a question back to you, yourself and Jessica, on getting that buy-in, because it is so important. Because look, some of these areas that we're going to be managing for nature might be a bit more raggedy and rough around the edges and not pristine and clipped and stuff as they historically have been.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've very much taken the kids pester power approach, and that's come from our CEO, who really got into sustainability because his kids were pestering him about it. And so we got a school engagement program called Eddie and Ellie, which we deliver on each development. It's Key Stage 2. Yeah, okay, it's kind of set of workshops based around a children's story about Eddie and Ellie who go on a wild adventure. And it's kind of all just about nature literacy. So that's one way we get them to understand, well, why do things look messier? Why do things look like this? And they kind of get the involvement from really early ages. And then it's also the flip side that with the adults setting up or you know, conservation groups on site. So they're involved or have some control over the management. And as I kind of said, if people feel like they have some ownership and feel like that it's being delivered for them, then they might start to engage with it a bit more. So it's kind of a dual approach, but get them through their kids, definitely.
Fantastic, absolutely. What was it? Proud, pleased with that. Jessica, anything from you to add? Or
nothing much to add, but yeah, I agree with that early engagement. You know, early engagement with local schools in terms of the design. So really getting them involved in that, and yeah, I think that them then going home and speaking to their parents in that community. And then once we get residents on site, sort of holding workshops, doing walks, depending on obviously the size of the development, but, you know, doing walks. We have partnerships with the London Wildlife Trust, so getting them down and explaining to the new residents on site, you know, what habitats we've put in place, why we've done it, and what the benefits are. So yeah, I think it is that real engagement on each level.
Absolutely, thank you. And actually, interestingly, I've just seen in the chat someone mentioned about the visual aid that Anthony, you were talking about, and actually the what good looks like. Actually, we as a business use that as a mechanism for demonstrating what looks good. And what it's come to me is actually, does that what good looks like actually need to be much earlier on in the system? So actually, it's part of the planning systems. The people, does everyone know what good looks like in terms of this type of grassland or this type of woodland or this type of habitat, etc., etc.? Does that need to be part of some of the kind of next steps, kind of research and resources and guidance that comes out of it? So yeah, I think some super thoughts there. And actually, what I like there, actually, what you also mentioned, Anthony, is about adaptable management and stuff. And look, no true is that in our business, and particularly in the works that we're doing now. Just as an example, look, and this is a site that we currently manage, and we manage it for nature as one of our biodiversity benchmark sites. Look, we have 5 different types of grassland areas to manage, and one of them ended up going into decline. Now as part of our adaptable management approach, we actually looked at that and changed and varied the mowing regime, put an early mowing regime in to address the issue, and it's transformed it, and species diversity in that grassland is coming back. So it just demonstrates that actually, with all of these management plans, and however clear and concise they are, as Katie and Nick mentioned earlier, the adaptable management is a key part of this, and responding to situations and as we go forward, it is super important, particularly, well, climate change as one that we know is coming through fruition. But let's move on. Neil, if I can come to you, if that's okay. And look, we all know how the value of linear infrastructure assets are for nature corridors. What are the challenges you are seeing, because you're a current custodian of managing land, and how you're embedding nature-led management for biodiversity net gain into your normal practice to meet your kind of overarching net gain targets?
Yeah, and I was going to actually, because I got the microphone, was going to sort of answer some of the previous questions. I was just, something Anthony said, it was all about, it's doing it with people, not to them. And I think it's that approach of actually, if you get that engagement, we've found that with works that where we've had to be working with communities, that whole with and not to is definitely something that really has to work. And then pulling in that, you know, and again, and Jessica said about working with the school children, but then it's actually working with colleagues. I remember a site we had where we just put in a new solar farm, and I asked, you know, what was there before you put in the panels? Oh, it's just some weedy, scrubby stuff. And it's that understanding of actually the stuff that doesn't look so pretty, doesn't look so manicured, is actually really important. And we've got a lot of that across the whole of the network, and that's one of the challenges, is getting people to understand what they're looking at, what they're managing, and how we can do it, and actually it is useful, and that the benefits that we can get of managing certain habitat types next to something like the operational railway, we can create the habitats that work really well in that sort of really tight infrastructure, but still give us those biodiversity benefits, because we have to do that thing. That running the railway thing is fundamentally what we're there for. But we've also got colleagues from property who need to make sure that the company is, you know, the land that is available to put units on that Anthony and Jessica can then build. We need to make sure that that is the right stuff. But, you know, we've had a site in Newcastle just recently where we've worked with the local authority. They put some constraints on in terms of what biodiversity needs to be on site. We've reduced the number of units that are being built on this land that is being sold for development, but the biodiversity still meets all the targets. And we've actually given up a small section of the railway adjacent, so outside the red line boundary of the new development. The biodiversity for that development is going to be managed and maintained on the railway side of the fence. So it's all about the collaboration, working together, making sure that we can do that. And that's the challenge, is getting everybody to understand that and think about it soon enough in the development. Don't wait until you're cutting the red ribbon, because it's far too late at that point. And that's where the last challenge, other than the funding thing, I won't go into that because everybody's got the same funding challenges, but it was almost the resources, but not just in terms of the number of people we've got doing it, but the succession planning of who's going to be doing what all of us are doing at the moment when the 30 years is up, and because I'm out of here by that point. I don't want to be retiring too late. But we've got colleagues in Southern region who are doing some excellent work creating nature reserves on our property that people have access to safely. They're doing this work in 2023, but you know what's going to happen? How are we getting those children that Anthony mentioned? How are we getting them enthused enough to know that they don't have to go into those disciplines? We want them to come into the railway and into ecology and environment to do all the stuff that we're trying to do, who will then take over the jobs that we're doing. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, not just the rail industry. It's just to get that succession of new environmental ecologists, etc., coming through.
I totally agree, and you picked on a much bigger subject there, is actually engaging the next generation, actually. And I know we're not focused on that today, but look, we all know there's a skill shortage across the UK in certain roles and stuff, but actually look, inspiring our children, I know it was mentioned earlier as a mechanism and means to engage and do stuff, but actually inspiring that future generation is super important. So no, totally agree with you there, Neil. And Elizabeth, if I can come to you just as a follow-on there from Neil, and look, linear infrastructures, as you mentioned and Neil mentioned, they're typically narrow tranches of land, and as an organisation employed to deliver BNG, what lessons are you able to share from your experiences today on both the on-site and off-site management, and then particularly how you guys, from a contracting perspective, are handing that back to the likes of Neil and Network Rail and other infrastructure clients?
Thanks. Yeah. So in the rail division, we've tended to have more success where we can deliver the biodiversity units within the footprint of the site. And I know that probably sounds blindingly obvious, but when we've had to go out to landowners, like adjacent landowners, to put in land management agreements, that can be more difficult because it's a whole another level of legal complexity. In our highways division, obviously they have similar challenges, and what they found is that national highways, they're a bit reluctant to do too much biodiversity upgrade on their own land, but they also don't want to buy new land for the purpose of biodiversity upgrade. So they're looking at different mechanisms for delivering the biodiversity net gain, and they've realised that they don't feel comfortable going into legal agreements with private individuals. However, they have made some headway making agreements with organisations like the Wildlife Trust, who will deliver the long-term monitoring, etc., deliver it for them. One thing, I was speaking to one of my colleagues about this, and one thing that she was saying is that national highways don't have powers to enforce the conservation covenants. I'm not sure if that is the same for other organisations. Another sort of challenge is that there's been quite a lot of competition for biodiversity units. So projects have identified an area where they might do some biodiversity upgrade, and then gone to the local authority and found that it's already been earmarked for someone else's biodiversity upgrade. So it's like we're all kind of scrambling for the same units, which it's kind of good that it's raised the profile, but it means that there's a lot of pressure to get it sorted out. And then kind of all that said, though, one thing that I feel about this is that it has really raised the profile of biodiversity, and it's got us into partnerships that we probably wouldn't have done before. We've made partnerships with universities, and they've done like research on the units that we've delivered. So I don't want to sound like it's all negative. I think it's really positive, and the biodiversity metric gives us a structure with which to deliver biodiversity net gain, and that's always useful. In terms of the challenges of handing the landowner, I've kind of handing the land back. We put in place kind of the proposed monitoring strategies, and we give them to the client, and then it's kind of a case of working with them over the first short period to make sure it's okay. But one of the challenges I find is that once the project's finished, our teams, they really want to get out of there, and it's quite so it has to be quite a quick handover process, which sometimes can be difficult, which is why it's important to talk about it early doors, which I think probably everyone has said.
Absolutely, thank you. And you raise a really interesting point, and it's not for today's webinar, which actually is the competition for land and the race for space for biodiversity units. And I think that potentially is another webinar in its own right to really go and have a look and drill into that as a piece. So that's great. I want to touch on a thing. I'm conscious we've probably only got about 7 minutes left of the whole of the session here, and there's just one bit I want to talk about, and actually, and I'll open up this question to Anthony to start with, but if everyone can chip in, and look, none of us want to see what good looks like in metric calculations, but then fails to materialize on the ground. Look, and that's the key is, and I guess is, look, how are we ensuring that proposals at that early stage are realistic and achievable, and what stage is management being considered? I know, Anthony, you touched on it a bit earlier, and I just wouldn't mind you expanding on that and then just opening that out to the floor, just to, because I think this is super important about the actual, are the units achievable, is the net gain achievable, and making sure there's checks and balances early doors, and who you engage with to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we touched on involving the management company or someone who has experience of managing land for long periods of time in that early design process. So you can really, as early as you're starting to think about habitats and where they're going, and so that kind of master planning even. It doesn't necessarily need to be the management company you're going to use, just someone who has that experience, because you won't necessarily know at that stage. And with them, I think, you know, we talk about following the mitigation hierarchy. Obviously, that is the basis of everything when you're considering biodiversity on site. But you have to do that with realism, not idealism. And Katie alluded to it earlier. It has to be achievable, and not all green open space can be high functioning wildflower meadow. That because it's you're going to have to think about nuisance. You're going to have to think about deliverability. I've killed enough plants in my own garden to know that you can replicate exactly the same conditions and have completely different outcomes. So you're not going to get the highest value everywhere across the site. And that's the bit that the management, you know, people who have that experience of long-term management can bring in as realism at the beginning stage. So I really think that's really important to kind of bring that in as early as possible.
Fantastic. I totally agree. And Jessica, Neil, Elizabeth, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think you know, it is really important to get that expertise on our kind of large regen sites with, you know, somewhere like Kidbrooke. We are getting sort of internal resources now with that real expertise of that landscape management to be able to, you know, upskill people in our technical team, but really be there as the voice to oversee the works, advise on changes in the design or the management as we go through the phases, and at the early stages really be able to challenge the landscape architects on the practicalities of maintenance, on climate resilience and things like that. And I think another point to mention that, you know, Anthony talked about killing plants in his own garden, and it's really having that gateway at the point that the landscape contractors are on the site installing, is to ensure, you know, the quality of the install, but also the quality of the plants and the topsoils, and really ensure that there is a gateway to actually look at that and a hold point to say, yeah, are we getting this as right as we can at that point in time.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you, Jess. Neil, Elizabeth, anything on that subject, or otherwise I wouldn't mind wrapping up and gaining your thoughts really on kind of the upskilling piece, which is obviously a key bit. It's been mentioned all the way throughout all of this kind of panel discussion, and just really your final thoughts on how we take this forward. What next step actions do we need to take about upskilling within your organisations? But we talk a lot about collaboration today. This is about sharing knowledge exchange. How are we going to take this forward, the upskilling element that we need to do?
I think I'll go first. I think from my perspective, the upskilling part, I think we need contractors and clients need to work together more about biodiversity from the get-go, in terms of identifying where biodiversity net gain might be done, making sure that if it's going to be on site, those site areas are protected and someone doesn't accidentally use them to batch concrete or something. So it's that kind of early working together from an early stage and prioritizing it, making it front and center. In the same way that other, like, you know, carbon has really risen up the agenda, I think biodiversity is soon to follow. And I'm looking forward to it. Absolutely. Go on, Neil, your turn.
Final thought from you, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, we've got what, 40,000 people in the business, and you know, we don't need to turn all those engineers and everything else into ecologists. We can't do that. We need to make sure that we're producing the right material, making available the right experts for those people to talk to make and help in those decision-making processes that will then mean that the work gets done correctly. I think, you know, we've got collaboration comes into, again, you know, our estate is 52,000 hectares. The data that we're using is 3.2 million hectares because it covers up the stuff that's a kilometre either side of the railway, and it's that approach, making sure that we can't or fit it all onto our land. Liz said that we're fighting over the same little bits of land, but if we can find the right bits of land, we can do that connectivity and connect everything up, regardless of whether it's our stuff or whether it's a Barclay site or what. It's not all about me, it's not all about the railway. We've got to do this together, and it's definitely that collaboration and getting the right experts in the right place so that we can make those right decisions.
And what a wonderful place to leave it, the whole connectivity and talking about the wider connectivity, which is actually what this is all about, which is as part of the Nature Recovery Network and stuff, and making more of our land open for nature and stuff. But look, I do apologise. We could talk all day around this subject, and there could be multiple questions coming in all day. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for you today. But thank you to everyone for joining Ground Control and our expert panels today and speakers to discuss Biodiversity Net Game. I hope, as I said at the start, I hope that you can take away some knowledge and insight on how important ongoing stewardship and adaptive management are to executing Biodiversity Net Game. Look, today's webinar, as I said at the start, will be made available to watch again alongside the speaker presentations and the links. My colleagues alongside this will be sharing with you shortly our BNG delivery guide, which is a useful guide that aligns to the REBA workflow, starting from early site selection advice all the way through to biodiversity value, assessing biodiversity values, all the way through to management and monitoring. So please watch out for that. Reach out to me if there's anything we can support you on, and if you want any more information. And look, hopefully you'll have 15-minute break now, comfort break, and join us over on the LinkedIn live Q&A chat. And we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you all today.